Good morning. My name is Alix Gallagher, and I'm the Director of Research Practice Partnerships at PACE, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, COVID-19, Education Funding and School District Budgets, Mitigating Negative Impacts in California. I want to apologize because our Executive Director, Heather Huff, cannot be here today. She is testifying at the state legislature on some of the issues connected to COVID-19. I would like to introduce our panel for the day. We have 4 esteemed panelists. The first is Carrie Hennell, an independent consultant, Jesse Levin, a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, or AIR, Michael Fine, the CEO of the Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team, FCMAT, and Richard Barrera, the board vice president for San Diego Unified School District. Today, our panelists will be discussing 4 topics critical for understanding the current funding situation. Carrie Hennell will be talking about COVID-19, education funding and school district budgets, and how to mitigate the negative impacts in California. Jesse Levin will be talking about exploring educational revenues and spending in fiscal crisis, followed by Michael Fine, who will be talking about preparing district budget and accounting systems for the new normal. Our final panelist will be Richard Barrera, talking about the urgency facing our students in schools. After our panelists speak, we're going to be having moderated questions for the panelists from the audience. A few logistical notes about how to get your questions into the Q&A. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Please type your questions and comments into that box, knowing that I will be monitoring the box throughout the webinar to raise up questions at the end. And as you're looking at the Q&A box, if you see others' entries that you think you'd like to second, please vote on those other entries so I understand how broad the interest is in each item. Also know that we'll be posting slides and link to resources on the PACE event page. And finally, the video recording from this webinar will be posted online early next week. And with that, I would like to turn over the webinar to our first panelist, Carrie Hennell. Carrie?
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Alix. My name is Carrie Hennell, and I'm an independent consultant and a fellow with the Opportunity Institute. And I'm going to be talking today about how the current economic crisis may impact California state education funding and what the state could do to mitigate harm. Okay. Before this economic crisis, school funding was improving. In recent work that PACE issued through the Getting Down to Facts series of studies, they showed that school funding in California recovered from the Great Recession, but was still below the national average. Now, this data only goes through 2014-15, but if you focus on that red line that represents California spending and trace that through to 2018-19, you'll see that there was quite an uptick in education spending per pupil between 2014 and 2019, thanks to tax revenues from Prop 30 and a surging economy. But still, as researchers have pointed out, including Jesse Levin, who's on the call today and was part of that Getting Down to Facts research, funding for schools still fell short of what many consider to be adequate, given California's goals as a state. In particular, those researchers looked at what it would take to fully implement the Common Core standards and other educational programs adopted in California, and found that California was roughly $3,000 per pupil short of where it needed to be. So while the school spending has been climbing, or at least was climbing before this current contraction, districts were still falling short of where they needed to be. And on top of that, districts have been experiencing rising cost pressures. For example, special education costs have been rising and caseloads have been increasing for some time now, even though education funding for special education has been declining. Also, pension liabilities have been occupying a greater share of district budgets. After a law change in 2014, contribution rates had to increase in order to pay down the state's $100 billion unfunded liability. And many of those costs fell onto district budgets. So whereas districts used to contribute roughly 8% of teacher salary to the pension fund, that number has roughly doubled. So that means that a greater share of the district budget is going to pensions, even though retirees are not necessarily experiencing better benefits as a result. And additionally, we see that rising healthcare costs pose an additional challenge to districts. In particular, those other post-employment benefits, or OPEBs, have risen quickly in the last decade, and those include benefits for retirees. So between insufficient funding and a budgetary squeeze, districts, despite the strong economic climate that we were in, we're experiencing what some researchers at Wested have described as a silent recession. And that was before we entered this economic downturn as a result of COVID-19. And now we likely face an actual recession. Economists predict that this could be the worst we've seen since the Great Depression, but we don't know yet how large it will be, how long it will last, or what the shape of the recovery might look like. But all indications are that it is going to be very difficult. Sorry, I'm one slide ahead. Very difficult for California education. Now, part of the reason for that is because education is, in California, heavily dependent on state funds. Our funding system is more dependent on state funds, particularly economically sensitive income taxes, than in most other states. In most other states, local property taxes play a larger role, and those are considered to be a more stable funding source. So California's heavy reliance on state funds means that when the economy tanks, education suffers here more than it does in many other states. So if you look at that 59% of California education funding that is comprised of state funds, and then we look at what those state funds are drawing upon, you can see that they're quite volatile. So the state funds that go to education come from the general fund, and the general fund in California is heavily reliant on personal income taxes. Those are very sensitive. As the stock market does particularly well, those funds surge, and California education funding does well. But when the economy tanks, education suffers more here than many other programs in California, and also than education in many other states. So all this means that schools in California should be bracing for a big hit. We have not yet heard how big that hit might be, but during the Great Recession, state and local funding for schools dropped by more than $7 billion in the first year. So that was about 15% of the Prop 98 funding. And economists are predicting that this year could be worse than that one was. So a triple whammy faces educators. We've got painful budget cuts that will be combined with increased student needs and increased costs as well. So what does this mean short term, midterm? Probably there will be a drop in the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee. What could the state do to mitigate against that? Well, there's nothing to stop the state from funding above the minimum guarantee. Now that's perhaps a difficult argument to make when the entire education budget is suffering. But as a reminder, the Prop 98 guarantee is intended to be a minimum floor, not a ceiling, and there is nothing to stop the state from putting additional funds into education. The second possible impact could be that the highest poverty school districts will experience big drops in funds. This is for a couple of reasons. First, if those cuts are made to the LCFF, that will mean that districts lose base grant funding, but that also high poverty districts and districts with many English learners will experience a commensurate hit to their supplemental and concentration funding. Proportionately, they're going to lose just as much as any other district, but in terms of per pupil dollars, the impact will be more severe. On top of that, those districts often have fewer fallbacks in the form of local parcel taxes, contributions from community or education foundations within the district, and also parent contributions. So what could the state do? Well, it could find ways to shield the supplemental and concentration funding from cuts. It could adopt some kind of hold harmless, or it could adjust the weights in some way so that those districts are somewhat protected. It could also target one-time funds, including stimulus dollars, to the highest need areas. And then finally, the third possible short and midterm impact will be that districts will need to adjust spending and make cuts. There are lots of strategies that could be considered for mitigating against this, or at least giving districts additional flexibility, in particular around spending and staffing decisions. And I believe some of my fellow panelists will speak more to that. And then finally, longer term, what do we need to be thinking about to protect and secure California school funding? These might be decisions and conversations that policymakers aren't quite ready to have, but we learned these same lessons during the Great Recession, and they're coming back to bite us again today. So it could be time to talk about how to diversify our tax base so California education is less dependent on those sensitive and volatile personal income taxes. That can mean looking at other tax sources like sales and use taxes, considering a greater role for the property tax, but also looking at the role between local and state investment in education. There's no reason that we can't increase the state role, the local role in investing in education, so long as the state plays an important kind of equalization kind of role in redistributing those funds to ensure equity. And then finally, we should revisit the funding formula that determines how much we invest in education. Prop 98 ensures that a certain amount goes into education, but that's very different from having a conversation about what our values and priorities are as a state and ensuring that we are investing commensurate with what those values are. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Jeannie.
Hi, so Carrie, thank you so much. I'm just going to start my timer so I don't go over here. So thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about educational revenues and spending in fiscal crisis. And I have a couple motivational questions here. And I'm not going to say that I'm going to answer these questions, but they're questions that I've attempted to provide some information on and help us think through what's important here. So the first is, how large might educational budget cuts be this time around, and how might they be shared across LEAs? The second question is, what are the patterns of resource allocation resulting from budget cuts? And this is more a stroll down memory lane historically to look at what happened during in the years of the Great Recession and following. And then finally, I have one slide that just talks about the additional types of analyses that we really probably should be doing in order to help us understand how California districts respond to fiscal crisis. So the first slide I wanted to show you is something that came out on January 20th from EdSource. This is what we thought was going to happen, right? And so there was going to be some continued modest increases in Prop 98 dollars, going up from 81.6 to 84 billion bucks. And as we all know now, we don't know how severe things are going to be, but here is what is happening. These are projections nationwide as to what the COVID-19 recession might look like. And as you can see, it is far more severe, at least in the second year, than the Great Recession was. So this gets back to what Carrie was talking about, that there are very serious concerns that this may be the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, I did a little bit of my own primary analysis here, where I cobbled together a couple of different analyses. One from PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, where they made projections of what would happen to Prop 98 funding in the next recession, and they modeled it based on some generic scenarios, mild, moderate, and severe, and then also some historical scenarios. The oil shock of the early 80s, dot-com bust, et cetera, and then of course the Great Recession. And I coupled together their findings with a brand new interactive tool that Michael Griffiths, previously of Education of the Economic Commission of the States, ECS, did. It was posted this past week in Ed Week and also came out under LPI's cover. And I put these two analyses together to figure out what might happen in California. And what we see is that if you look at the generic scenarios, without any of the CARES stimulus funding from the feds, in a mild recession, we'd be expected to lose about $665 per student. In a severe recession, that would go up to $1,591 per student. And then if we look at if the modeling on the Great Recession, without the CARES funding, the federal stimulus, it would be about $1,700 per student, which is huge. Now with the CARES, you can take off that $293 per student and we get down to about $1,400. Still a huge, huge number. Okay, now I'm not going to make any claims as to how accurate these estimates are. Like I said, I've coupled together two different analyses to make these projections, and I've not done any primary modeling on my own on this. However, this gives you a glimpse of how severe it might be. Now, what are we worried about here with budget cuts? One of the primary things that we're worried about is the degree to which the budget cuts will be felt more by districts that have higher needs. So here's an example from New York. Now, they had a preliminary budget and then they had their revision earlier than us, okay? So on the y-axis here, this is measured in terms of their preliminary budget minus their their current budget minus their it's the difference between what they were originally promised and the revised budget. And on the x-axis, you can see economic disadvantage in terms of students who are economically disadvantaged. All of these are districts. And what we see is this downward trend. So as an example, a district in New York with about 90% of its students economically disadvantaged stands to have about $500 less per pupil than what they had expected before in the original budget. So this is showing that the budget cut is really pretty severe for that 90% economically disadvantaged district. Whereas if you go to about 20%, the difference is about -50. So they stood to lose about $50 from what they were originally promised. Now, this is a consideration that we should all take in California. What is going to happen in the next round of budget cuts? And how can we insulate those districts that are most needy? We also did a regression analysis of this. So we controlled for several other factors here, and we found the same pattern. Even up here, it's pretty flat. So the $50 loss per student for the 20% district is still there, but it's even exaggerated down here at the 90%. It's closer to about $600 per student. Let's bring it to California here, and I want to shift a little bit because we really don't know what the funding distribution is going to look like. But what we can do is take a stroll down memory lane and look at what happened to spending. And clearly, spending took a hit, as we all knew. The shaded area here is the Great Recession years, and we can see that we've got 5 trend lines here. The baby blue trend line are those highest poverty districts. That is quintile 5, okay? Whereas the lowest poverty districts are this dark blue. We can see that pretty across the board there was a decrease. So for instance, we went from about, these are all in 2019 dollars, okay? So for the highest poverty districts, we went from about spending of about $12,500 in 2019 dollars down to about $11,000, okay? Similar drops occurred over the same period, but what were the distributional effects? It's pretty hard to see, but you can see that there's a bit of a narrowing here towards the end of the recession and compared to the beginning of the recession. All right. to look at the distributional consequences a little closer, these are scatter plots of districts across California. Poverty by the difference from their pre-recession spending to their within recession spending for each of these years. And as you can see, the fitted line becomes more downwardly sloped. That means things became less progressive. Spending became less progressive over the course of the Great Recession. And we want to avoid that if we can. Now, to dig a little deeper into resource allocation, Carrie already pointed to some of this, but we can see, okay, instructional salaries took a big hit here, all right? Pupil support, not so much. School administration, you know, small decline, pretty flat though, and really all the different types of districts with respect to poverty were almost on top of each other. Same with district administration. Here's other, it's a big catch category. And so we did see a drop, but that includes a lot of different things, right? And the spread here at the end of the recession is narrower than the spread towards the beginning of the recession. So things probably became a little less equitable. Finally, we see employee benefits where they just skyrocket afterwards. So what do we take from that? Well, this is going to be huge. If we can't figure out a way to provide some of that relief, there's going to be a lot of pressure on districts, especially after the budget cuts here. They're simply not going to be able to afford the employee benefit contributions. Finally, I've got about a minute left, so I'm going to fly through some of these. How did they go about, districts go about dealing with reallocating their resources? Well, pupil-teacher ratios definitely went up, okay? And we can see that from this slide, went up across the board. While the level of pupil-teacher ratio tended to be lower for the most impoverished school districts or needy school districts, the trend was really pretty much the same. Finally, the question is, you're increasing pupil-teacher ratios, so you're necessarily getting rid of teachers, right? So what happened to the distribution of teachers with respect to experience? Well, what we found was really patterns that were very consistent with last in, first out policies of hiring and retention. So right here, we're looking at the percentage of teachers with 1 or fewer years of experience. And what we can see is at the start of the recession, these guys dropped off immediately. For the most needy districts, they started hiring back those types of teachers, hiring back or possibly getting rid of some of their more experienced teachers later on in the latter half of the recession. Everybody did that. There was sort of a jump in the replenishing of the share of very inexperienced teachers towards the second half. The next couple of slides just show you in the other parts of the distribution. So these are lower experienced teachers, 2 to 5 years, and there's a steady drop across the board. And these teachers, those teachers with greater than 10 years of experience made up a larger share of the teaching population as we went through the recessionary years, okay? The last thing I wanted to talk about here, because I'm probably going over time, is looking at reserve funding. There's been some directive, there's going to be continued directive for districts to start looking at their reserves. The variation in the amount of reserves that districts have are all over the map. So there's a pretty wide variation. And a lot of it depends on whether you're a very small district, and I think there are some rules that allow them to even have much larger reserves than larger districts, which are capped there. There's a minimum reserve requirement of 3%, which is not that much at all. There's not too many districts down there. But the main takeaway here is that those districts with deeper pockets, larger reserves, are going to be able to ride this out a little better and put off very difficult decisions longer than those districts that have very small reserves. They're going to have to do some fancy footwork pretty quickly. Finally, potential areas of investigation. Really, continue on that line and see the degree to which different types of districts use reserves to navigate their budget cuts. Let's look at the extent to which districts' capacity to raise local local funding might lead to inequities. So we're talking about those districts that are more able to pass parcel taxes or depend on private funding. And then finally, it would be interesting to look at the responses to the budget cuts and do a comparison between charter organizations and traditional public schools. And that's what I have for you. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think Carrie and Jesse have laid out some certainly potential scenarios looking at our past experience when we have dramatic changes in our economy. I want to get a little bit more practical at this point for the practitioners out there. The bottom line right now for us is that we don't have any of this data. We don't know quite yet how far state tax receipts are falling. We won't know that for a couple more months. We do have an indication of where monthly withholding is trending. We have an indication certainly on unemployment. But as you all know, and has been pointed out, we have a very progressive tax system. More than 50% of our personal income tax comes from the 1%ers who pay quarterly, and the April 15th quarterly payment was obviously deferred to July 15th. And so we're missing big chunks of information and data to make some informed decisions at this moment. That all leads to what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So we will have an on-time May revision from the Department of Finance and the governor's office. We will have to wait and see how much data is really there that we can rely on. And knowing that 2 weeks will give us some more data, but it will not fill the data gap that we have right now to make some informed decisions. Just a month after that, less than a month, we'll have a June adopted budget. And unlike during times in the Great Recession, where that adopted budget was pushed out, we won't have that same opportunity due to Proposition 25. We'll have an on-time June budget. The concern for many of us is that budget needs to be very conservative, to use the LAO's terms, baseline low. We don't want to set the stage, if we can at all avoid it, for too optimistic of a forecast in June, because LEAs do not handle mid-year cuts well. It's just not the nature of the industry. It's not how we staff and structure our expenditures. We simply don't do well with those mid-year adjustments. So I think the real, from a timing standpoint of filling in some here on topics that Carrie and Jesse have talked about, we're really looking at the fall, sometime August, September, and beyond, after the state has had the opportunity to see the July 15th collections and do the appropriate analysis and see where we're trending. That doesn't mean that everybody sits still for the next 2 weeks and doesn't work on a budget for next year. The planning cycles for school districts and LEAs in general started back in January with the Jan 10 budget release, and obviously all that is going to be reset at this point. I think what is fair to say is everything we knew in January is off the table, and we'll be starting fresh. These next 2 weeks, even before the May revision, is absolutely a critical time for school districts to run scenarios and to begin to discuss internally and even in more public settings the potential impacts using some of the history that we know that Carrie and Jesse have alluded to. We can do those with scenarios, set a best case, a midpoint, a worst case scenario with both budget and, very importantly, with cash. The question that's before us right now is not how big, the question that's before us is how big is the deficit going to be, not how big is the COLA going to be. In a matter of days, we'll see the federal implicit price deflator, which is the basis for the COLA on the local control funding formula. I expect that number to be a positive number, but it'll be a very different funded COLA when that decision is ultimately made sometime between now and the fall. And so Using some of our history, just looking at some of the trend data that's even available to us today, we can probably come up with scenarios of best case and worst case for LEAs to begin to grapple with, put their arms around, figure out how to mitigate some of those issues. How does this recession that we're entering into and are actually in differ from the last before we had LCFF under the old revenue limit / categorical programs? I think the answer to that question, and certainly some of the comparative data you've already looked at, begins to speak to this, but I believe it's the pace of the decline in state revenues. We ramped up, while that first year, the Great Recession was very severe, we ultimately ramped up to a peak of cuts and cash deferrals, apportionment deferrals by the state to local educational agencies over about a 2.5 to 3 year period. I think we're going to be very close to that here in this first year. So I think we're talking about the peaks of the Great Recession. We're going to see that peak and potentially exceed it on a very rapid pace. That'll be the biggest difference by way of the time that we have to deal with this, the time that we have to plan, and so on. There's no question in my mind that the level of reductions will be that'll be required, that will happen in Prop 98 will be significant, and then at the LEA level, certainly over time, how that will be significant. We have an experience base dealing with economic downturns. What we don't have an experience base in doing is what's been coupled with this economic downturn, and that's a complete change and upheaval of our school operations, moving from brick and mortar instructional settings to distance learning. The potential that we reopen school next year and then have a surge in the impact from the virus and have to close again. And then potentially that's early enough in the year that we consider reopening again after that. All those variables lead us to have to kind of re-envision what school looks like, what's average daily attendance in that environment, which is the basis of our funding. Do we move to enrollment that's more stable? Do we look at a prior year ADA instead of current year ADA? What's the alternative school schedule configurations, an A and B kind of schedule, morning and afternoon, or just having 20% of our kids on campus on any given day, coupled with some type of distance learning support. Those introduce a whole new set of challenges, none of which are inexpensive during a time period in which our revenues are going to be dropping. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Richard Barrera. I'm on the San Diego Unified School Board. I'm in my 12th year on the board of the school district, and so I was elected in November of 2008. And the first major decision that I and my colleagues had to make was mid-year cuts. You know, the type that Michael was talking about. We had to make mid-year cuts in January of 2009, and so we lived through you know, the recession years. But I think what Carrie and Jesse's data showed is definitely our lived experience, which is we've never come out of the recession. I think school districts have experienced, you know, this idea of a silent recession, in that our expenses, both in terms of our investments in our employees and our special education costs, have outpaced the level of increased revenues from the state. And so I've never, this is my 12th year on the board, I've never experienced a budget season where we talk about what we're going to increase in investing in our students. It's always about what we're going to cut. Our district, we've got about 100,000 students. We are about 63% unduplicated count. I represent a sub-district which has about 90% unduplicated count. And it's important, you know, for me to talk about, despite the fact that we have experienced nonstop difficulty in maintaining our budgets through the recession years and then coming out of the recession years, we've actually seen substantial increases in academic outcomes during that time. So we instituted a UC A to G for all policy in 2009 that went first into effect with the class of 2016. Our UC A to G completion rates in 2011 were about 44%. In 2019, they were 73%. And the largest portion of that growth was with our Latino and African American students. Our Latinx students were graduating about 25% with UC A to G completion rates in 2011. Now in 2019, it's up to 2/3. So what has happened during this this period of always struggling to figure out how we're going to plug our budget gaps every year has been a focus on building the capacity of our educators to improve our educational outcomes for our students. We've never, as some of the slides have indicated, we've never recovered in terms of student to teacher ratios. In fact, they've declined since the recession. We've never recovered with some of the other programs that were important to our kids. But what we have done is we've focused on retaining our educators and investing professional development in them so that they're able to handle an increasing set of needs. I've got a school in my sub-district, a K-8 school, that 5 years ago, about 4% of the students were homeless. Today, 40% of those students are homeless, and yet we've continued to see increases in academic outcomes even in that school because we've invested so much in the teaching team, including investments in professional development around social emotional learning. So our greatest fear as we go through this process, both now in the fall and then looking outwards, is that we will end up completely destabilizing the teams that have managed to provide improved academic outcomes for our kids. It is absolutely the case, as one of the slides pointed out, that if we're in a process of large numbers of layoffs, that will mostly destabilize the highest poverty schools in our district where we've seen the largest gains. So what we're experiencing right now is what I think most districts are experiencing is with our school closures, we've moved to full distance learning. We're out there serving lunch and breakfast to our students and their families every day. And that costs money. Our move to full distance learning is costing, we estimate, about $200 per student above our 1920 budget. That's the cost that we'll spend through the rest of this school year. Of course, we anticipate that we will see significant learning loss. And so to provide, extended summer school or an extension of the school year or some other way of dealing with learning loss prior to the beginning of the next school year, we estimate those costs in our district to be about $500 per student, again, above any budgeted amount that we have. And then if we get into the fall and we're talking about mid-year cuts or into the next year with the levels of $2,000 per student potential loss, as I think Jesse's slides were indicating, we will see a complete disruption of everything that we have been making progress on in our district. And, we anticipate that, as Mike laid out, the cost of providing some sort of hybrid model in a gradual reopening will be more expensive than the costs in a typical school situation. To make distance learning work, we're going to need lower class sizes. We're going to need more social and emotional support for students. We're going to need more investment actually in just sort of the cleaning of our physical infrastructure. So these types of cuts will devastate school districts up and down the state, and the impact will mostly be felt on the most vulnerable students. So what we are, in a coalition of local stakeholders and with other school districts, what we are advocating for right now is really, kind of three main areas. With the state, we are advocating for some emergency relief to deal with the move to distance learning and potential summer school. The areas that we would advocate the state to look at are absolutely the state's rainy day fund, and we know that that's going to be depleted quickly, but the school closures are part of the emergency. The state got roughly $15 billion in the CARES Act to deal with emergency costs. The costs of school closure and move to distance learning is part of those emergency costs, and so we would advocate that the state puts some of those resources into helping school districts. Then, as we look into the fall, we know that cuts of the magnitude that we're discussing are beyond the capacity of the state to handle, and so our focus of advocacy really needs to be about getting significant contribution for schools into the upcoming federal stimulus packages. We believe, as do a coalition of educator stakeholders nationally, that we need to see something in the range of $200 billion just to stabilize our situation in the 2021 year. And then if we look out into the following year, 21-22, we need about $350 billion of federal stimulus just to provide stability as we go through this continuing transition. That federal money has to be written in a way that state governments cannot supplant their investment in public education. That's critical. And then, of course, as I think Carrie referred to in the first slide, we need to talk about where we're going to be as a state coming out of this situation. Are we going to continue, as we've been for 40 years, to underfund public education and leave school districts in the vulnerable place we are now in the case of emergencies to come forward? We need to be looking at tax packages or reforms that allow us both at the state level to bring to voters opportunities to invest in schools. And every time we do that, and we saw that with Prop 30 and we saw that with Prop 55, voters say yes. And we need to enable local districts to have more ability to go to our local voters. The reason that there's inequity in parcel taxes is because the 2/3 requirement means that in general, the only districts that are able to pass parcel taxes are wealthy districts. When the threshold for passing school bonds went from 2/3 to 55%, the result was hundreds of billions of dollars of local investment in school facilities. We've passed $8.5 billion of school bonds in the last 12 years, none of which would have met a 2/3 threshold, but all exceeded the 55%. So enabling local school districts to go to voters with a threshold that's possible, whether it's a 55% parcel tax or whether it's simply enabling school districts to go to local voters with a menu of potential taxes, including increase in ad valorem property taxes at a 50% level for general operations, that has to be part of the package to pull us out of this 40-year scenario that we've seen in California. So we need, going forward, we need more revenue at the state level. We need more revenue at the local level. Right now, we need immediate relief from the state to deal with the costs that we are all incurring. And we need a significant investment for schools in the next round of federal stimulus.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that the Q&A is open. If you have any questions that you would like raised up, please enter them into the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and you can also vote for other people's questions if they are of interest. There are a couple issues that seem to be coming up repeatedly, and I think there are two sides to some of them. One are some questions about how we can increase the funding, and then there are another set of questions that are really around what to cut. So I want to start with a question about increasing the funding. That question is about whether or not there has been any discussion of deficit spending by the state, given the current crisis. with the idea that trying to get schools open and operating more effectively than before the pandemic is probably the only reasonable path forward. And I will note that one commenter also suggests this might be constitutionally prohibited, but I did want to throw it open to the panel. If I could add in as well, someone suggested relying on investors or foundations as another possibility.
Well, this is Mike, and I'll take a little bit of stab. The state doesn't have the same constitutional flexibility with regard to deficit spending as the federal government does. The state doesn't operate in its state printing office a currency printing operation like the feds do. And so there are some constitutional limits around that. I think the question is better framed in my mind, and it's not short-term but long-term. And I believe it was Carrie that actually is the one that raised it, is this idea about restructuring our tax system, our tax structure, so that it's a little less volatile, although I'm not sure anything, any place we're willing to go with that would have protected us in this particular environment. It may have slowed the impact down a little bit. There was a second piece to that that I was going to jump onto, and I've already forgotten what it was. Sorry.
The idea was raising additional funds from investors or foundations.
Yeah, thanks. So let me use Marin as an example. Marin County, a high wealth county for the most part, certainly ranked very high in the country, not just in California. They already have sizable parcel taxes in place. Most recent renewals of those have actually been a challenge to get them renewed. But they also, their schools benefit significantly from private foundations, and they are feeling that pinch right now. So while that's maybe a path to go down to think about is the private side, but what I can tell you is where we have that private side today, and I'll use Marin as an example, they're already feeling the punch and the pinch, both from foundations slowing down their giving, from folks slowing down their giving to foundations, not certain what the next few months and the next couple of years look like. So there's a balance there somewhere with regard to effectiveness of that.
And if I could just jump in. So again, if we see a $2,000 per student cut, that's $200 million in our district. I think that's roughly about $20 billion from the state level. There is no private philanthropy that can even provide a drop in the bucket of dealing with that kind of cut. We're a public education system. We rely on taxes, on public revenue in order to support our kids. One of the analysis that we've seen Bruce Baker at Rutgers every couple of years is he looks at the percentage of a state's wealth, either GDP or personal income, that's invested into public education. And that number nationally has actually also gone down since the Great Recession. And in California, we receive a failing grade on what Bruce Baker calls effort. We need to make a greater effort as a state in providing real sustainable revenue that our students need. This $3,000 per student analysis, that's about the number that we looked at 5 years ago and asking ourselves what it would take to eliminate the achievement gap, and that number was $3,000 per student 5 years ago. So we need to get serious as a state and not believe that somehow a couple of foundation grants are going to get us out of this. That's not realistic. In the short term, there is only really one answer, and that is the federal stimulus packages, because as Mike said, the state does not have the ability to go into deficit spending. So it has to be a focus on real federal stimulus for schools. And coming out of it, We need to challenge ourselves as a state to make greater effort and bring more revenue into our public schools. And that means enabling local school districts to go to our voters and ask, are you willing to invest? And we need to get more revenue options before voters statewide.
Let me turn to the other side of this equation. You both spoke to thoughts about increasing funding, but there are a lot of comments and questions coming up in the chat about what should be cut in the likely scenario that there will be cuts, and suggestions include across-the-board cuts to educator salaries and also addressing issues around benefits and pensions. I wonder if any of the panelists want to speak to this question about what to cut or what cuts they believe are likely.
Well, this is Mike again. I'll take a stab at this. I think that's an individual district decision. One of the things that came out of the Great Recession, along with the local control funding formula, is what I consider the gem in that reform that Governor Brown at the time put forth, and that is the local control accountability plan. I think plans are good in good times, as we've experienced in the last decade, and plans are good in more difficult times. They guide us. Those plans, while they'll need to be revised, and while we have just last week an executive order changing the timelines around those to ensure that we have can continue to have solid stakeholder engagement in the development of those plans will obviously have to refocus a little bit. It is a mixed bag across the state, some on how those plans are approached. Some districts put 100% of their funding, all state funds, all local funds, all federal funds in that plan, and the plan is a comprehensive plan for all kids with a focus certainly on what the state requires them to focus on with respect to certain subgroups of kids and certain priorities. Other districts only put their LCFF funds in the plan, and still others only put their supplemental and concentration funds in the plan, so it's a mixed bag. We would advocate as a best practice that to properly fund schools and to look at the big picture, you have to have all the puzzle pieces together. And the plan should be comprehensive across that serves all kids with the proper focus, obviously on what it's about. And so you've got to mix your federal funds, especially right now where they are going to provide some significant assistance along with flexibility in how those funds are spent. But you've got to include all the puzzle pieces in that plan. And that ultimately drives then where you trim, what you focus on, what you may even increase. I think generally speaking, across the board types of cuts where you cut everything by 10% is ludicrous. It's simple, but it's lazy by our leaders when they take that approach. That ignores priorities. It ignores certain subgroups of kids. It's not the proper way to do it. You've got to hunker down, and the professional staff and the local elected school trustees have to ultimately make some very difficult decisions. We're an industry that, in my opinion, while certainly labor costs and benefit costs are a very high percentage for every school district and charter school in the state, they're spending 85 to 90 cents of every dollar they get on people. This is a people business. It takes people to accomplish our purposes with kids. But for the most part, we don't have extraordinary pay rates. We're not paying our teachers what we're paying ball players. Personally, I think we've got it all backwards there. And so simple pay cuts are not, in my opinion, the answer either. Maybe we have to look at a different school year, such as we did in the Great Recession, and furloughs and employees share some of the burden here. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but a uniform pay cut and so on is again ignores priorities. Health benefits are difficult for every school entity out there. Together, we have tremendous purchasing power that we don't take advantage of in influencing that marketplace. Pension costs are clearly an issue. Billions of dollars in increases, as Carrie's slide showed. earlier over the last decade. So those are a couple thoughts.
I'll just throw in again, I apologize if Carrie and Jesse want to jump in, but I agree with everything Michael just said. You know, cuts have to be targeted and they've got to be based on priorities. And in particular, in a diverse school district, we've got to focus first on the needs of our most vulnerable students. Doing that is a hard thing to do because if by focusing on the needs of our most vulnerable students, we make our public schools less attractive to students, to families who have options, we can lose enrollment in the process. So there's no, you know, these are all Sophie's choices. Again, as I said, the key to our academic progress has been investment in our people. We're a very high cost of living area in San Diego. That's true in a lot of places in California. It's very difficult for our educators, as Mike said, who don't get paid a lot to begin with, to keep up with the cost of living. So when we start to cut salaries, there can be implications in terms of our ability to retain educators. We're proud of the fact that in our district, about 94% of teachers who start with us are still with us after 5 years. But if we start either cutting salaries or shifting the cost of healthcare onto those employees, we worry about our ability to continue to retain teachers. Mike's point about school districts and coalitions of school districts able to deal directly with medical providers, we believe can save a lot of money. If we can control healthcare costs by identifying those providers who provide the most cost-effective services to our employees, and there's legislation to that effect that we have been advocating for. We think we can help with that can help with the rise of healthcare costs. But again, you know, there's no simple solution here, and it's again why I would prefer our focus is not right now on how we are going to deal with devastation. We've got an opportunity now to advocate for federal stimulus that helps mitigate that devastation. And that's where our effort needs to go, because once we get into these range of cuts that we're talking about, believe me, there is no answer that is not going to be devastating to our most vulnerable students.
I wanted to look across a couple of questions and ask about flexibility that might be useful from a policy perspective. One question that came in is whether it would be helpful to have flexibility in the counting of instructional minutes to meet funding requirements, with a note that that does require some changes to ed code. And the question I wanted to ask the panel is whether there are any, if that or other particular areas of flexibility might be particularly helpful in allowing districts to navigate these difficult choices. Carrie?
Yeah, I think it's going to be important to look at things that the legislature could do right now to increase flexibility. Absolutely, instructional minutes would be worth looking at. In addition, things like class size requirements or the incentives that we have in LCFF to lower class sizes, flexibility around school calendars, flexibility around things like competency-based graduation requirements and credit accruals. Those are all things that constrain what educators can do and have implications for costs as well. Teacher layoffs would be another one. There's a limited layoff window that's typically used in California in March. There is a rarely used window in the summer that could be leveraged this year if the legislature were to permit it to stand. Those kinds of things would be important to look at immediately to increase flexibilities. The important point that I want to make about those, though, is that they need to be put side by side with what quality education looks like. We know that district leaders need more room in their budgets and their decision making to move students and staff around and to make tough choices, but we also don't want to do things that the research has shown are not good for kids. And so I think that's where there could be some new analysis and some, idea generation. Perhaps that's a role for the funding community to put together some proposals around that, but certainly those flexibilities need to happen quickly.
So this is Jesse. I just wanted to add something in here. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues who are up here because they're saying everything that's going on in my head as well. I just wanted to piggyback on Michael's point about a few things. First of all, with respect to flexibility, one other flexibility that Carrie didn't mention here is flexibility in terms of being able to blend, not only just coordinate funding that seems categorical, but the federal government expects districts and even schools to not only coordinate funding from, say, Title I and IDEA with our state funding sources, but also to blend them or combine them. And research that I've done has shown that across the country, districts and schools are not using the leverage they already have or the flexibility they already have. Now the doors are really open, especially with the stimulus money, to increase the flexibility with which dollars are used. The second thing that I wanted to, again, piggyback on Michael's statement is really in terms of doing budget cuts across the board. That is not only very dangerous in terms of equity. That is, some students might, the most needy students might really not be getting the services that they need. And you might be sort of carving out those programs, and you shouldn't be doing that. But also just, it doesn't make sense from an efficiency standpoint. That is, if you want to find the most efficient solution, that is the one. You have budget cuts and you want to spread those budget cuts to minimize the drop in quality of service or program. You don't just do an across the board cut. You try to prioritize and figure out what pieces of your program are not working well, which could you get rid of and really minimize the loss to the services to the students. So really, from an economics point of view, it's both equity and also efficiency in terms of thinking about your cuts and being very thoughtful about where you are dropping resources out of your program. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here. Everybody's probably nodding their head saying, yeah, we knew that, Jesse, but I just wanted to put it out there.
Okay, and I took a look at the clock. It is noon, so we have to end this. Many people have asked in the Q&A. We will be posting all of this information online. We also want to take a moment to let you know about our next webinar on May 8th, focused on supporting student socio-emotional learning as a force for recovery. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much for joining us.